The wind whipped across the Colorado frontier as Florence Sullivan clutched her father's pocket watch, its golden face gleaming in the fading light of dusk. The year was 1878, and the vast, untamed wilderness of Julesburg stretched before her like a canvas of uncertainty and promise. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles west from Boston to claim what was rightfully hers, her late father's homestead. But the journey had already proven far more perilous than she could have imagined. Florence adjusted her bonnet as the stagecoach rattled to a stop. The 6-day journey from Omaha had left her bones aching and her spirits dampened, but determination burned in her chest like wildfire. At 22, she had abandoned everything familiar to honor her father's final wish, that she would take over the land he had purchased but never lived to see. "Julesburg, madam," the driver announced, helping her down from the coach. "Not much to look at, but it's home to some." Florence surveyed the dusty Main Street with its weathered wooden buildings. A saloon, general store, blacksmith, and small sheriff's office made up the heart of the town. Men in worn hats and dusty boots moved purposefully about, some casting curious glances at the newcomer in her travel-worn but clearly Eastern clothing. "My father's property," she said, retrieving a folded document from her reticule. "Sullivan's Ridge. Might you direct me?" The driver scratched his beard. Sullivan's Ridge. That'd be about 8 miles north across Rattlesnake Canyon. Not a journey for a lady alone, especially with nightfall coming. "I've come too far to delay," Florence replied firmly. "Is there someone who might guide me there today?" "Sheriff might know someone," the driver suggested, gesturing toward the small office. "But most folks don't cross that canyon after dark. The bridge there ain't the sturdiest thing, and the drop's 100 feet if you're lucky." Florence thanked him and made her way to the sheriff's office, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each determined step. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her progress. The sheriff was a graying man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Sullivan's Ridge," he repeated after she explained her situation. "That's Jeb Sullivan's place. Heard he passed. My condolences, miss." "Thank you," Florence said. "I understand it's a difficult journey, but I'm quite determined to reach it today." The sheriff sighed, rising from his desk. "There's a man might help you. Blake Vasquez. Keeps to himself mostly but knows these parts better than most. Might find him at the livery." Florence thanked him and hurried to the livery stable at the edge of town. The smell of hay and horses greeted her as she entered the dimly lit structure. A tall figure stood in the shadows, brushing down a magnificent chestnut stallion. "Mr. Vasquez," she called. The figure turned, and Florence found herself looking into the most striking blue eyes she had ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a worn leather hat. The man couldn't have been more than 30, with dark stubble along a strong jawline and shoulders broad enough to suggest years of hard physical labor. "Who's asking?" His voice was deep, with a hint of wariness. "Florence Sullivan. I need a guide to my father's property at Sullivan's Ridge." Blake Vasquez studied her for a long moment. "Sullivan's Ridge is across Rattlesnake Canyon. Night's coming. Not a good time for traveling, especially for a city woman." Florence bristled. "I assure you, Mr. Vasquez, I'm quite capable. I'll pay you well for your trouble." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It's not about money, Miss Sullivan. That rope bridge isn't something to take lightly, especially in the dark." "Then we should depart immediately, before we lose more daylight," she countered. Blake stared at her, seeming to measure her determination. Finally, he nodded once. "Your funeral," he muttered, though loud enough for her to hear. "I'll saddle 2 horses. Can you ride?" "I can," she assured him, though her experience was limited to gentle rides in Boston's parks. "And I appreciate your assistance, Mr. Vasquez." Within 30 minutes, they were riding north out of Julesburg, Florence doing her best to keep up with Blake's easy, confident posture in the saddle. Her mare was gentle enough, but the rough terrain made for an uncomfortable journey. "Your father never mentioned a daughter," Blake said after they had ridden in silence for several miles. "We were estranged," Florence admitted. "After my mother died, he headed west. I remained in Boston with my aunt. We corresponded occasionally, but I haven't seen him in 10 years. Yet you came all this way for his property," Florence hesitated. "It was his dying wish. In his last letter, he begged me to come, said he'd found something important, something that would change everything." Blake gave her a sidelong glance but said nothing more as they continued their journey. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, and Florence felt her confidence waning as the light dimmed further. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached a deep ravine carved into the earth. "Rattlesnake Canyon," Blake announced, dismounting. "We'll lead the horses from here. The bridge is just ahead." Florence slid from her saddle, her legs trembling slightly from the unaccustomed ride. The canyon stretched before them, a great gash in the earth with a raging river far below. Spanning the gap was a weathered rope bridge, its wooden slats swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "That's the bridge." Florence couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. "Told you it wasn't something to take lightly," Blake replied. "Still want to press on." "We could camp here, cross at first light." Pride and determination overrode her fear. "No, I've come this far." Blake tied their horses securely to a nearby tree. "I'll go first. Test each board before putting your full weight on it. Hold the ropes tight and don't look down." He crossed with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to danger, his movements sure and steady despite the bridge's swaying. When he reached the other side, he turned back to her. "Your turn, Miss Sullivan." Slow and steady. Taking a deep breath, Florence stepped onto the first wooden slat. The bridge swayed alarmingly and she clutched the rope sides with white-knuckled hands. One step, then another. The wind picked up, causing the bridge to sway more violently. "You're doing fine," Blake called. "Keep coming." Florence was halfway across when she heard a faint creak, then a snap as one of the supporting ropes began to fray. Fear paralyzed her for a crucial moment. "Run!" Blake shouted. "Florence, run now!" She tried to surge forward, but it was too late. With a sickening lurch, the bridge gave way beneath her feet. A scream tore from her throat as she plummeted, her hands desperately clutching at the remaining rope. By some miracle, she caught it, finding herself dangling over the abyss, the raging river 100 feet below. "Hold on." Blake's voice cut through her panic. To her amazement, Blake had not hesitated. In one fluid motion, he had grabbed the remaining support rope and was swinging out across the gap toward her, his powerful form arcing through the twilight air. His timing was perfect. He reached her just as her strength began to fail. One strong arm wrapped around her waist, the other gripping the rope with iron strength. "I've got you," he growled in her ear. With a powerful swing, Blake propelled them toward the canyon wall. Florence felt the impact as they hit the rocky face, Blake taking the brunt of it with his body to shield her. Somehow, impossibly, he began to climb, hauling both of them upward along the canyon wall, finding hand and footholds where she saw none. When they finally reached the top, Blake pulled her onto solid ground. They collapsed together, breathing heavily. Florence became acutely aware of his arm still around her waist, the heat of his body against hers. "You saved my life," she whispered, looking into his face, now inches from her own. Something flickered in his blue eyes: concern, relief, and something else she couldn't name. "Couldn't let you fall," he said gruffly, finally releasing her and sitting back. "Not when you've come so far." Florence sat up, pushing wind-blown hair from her face. "How will we get back?" or reach the ridge now. There's another way, Blake said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. Longer route, but safer. We'll have to leave the horses, though. They'll be fine until morning. Florence accepted his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm as he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. Thank you, Mr. Vasquez. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Blake, he corrected, and staying alive would be repayment enough. Your father wouldn't forgive me if I let anything happen to his daughter. You knew him well, Florence asked, surprised. Blake's expression grew guarded. Well enough, come on. We've got some walking ahead of us. As darkness fell completely, they made their way along the canyon rim by the light of a lantern Blake had in his saddlebag. Florence noticed he stayed close to her, occasionally steadying her with a light touch when the terrain grew treacherous. Did my father ever mention why he wanted me to come here? Florence asked as they walked. Blake was silent for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. Finally, he said, Your father had his secrets, Miss Sullivan. Not my place to share them. Florence, she corrected. And they're my secrets now, aren't they? If they concern my property. Some secrets are better discovered than told, Blake replied cryptically. We'll reach the cabin by midnight. You can start discovering tomorrow. They walked in silence for another hour, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant call of night birds. Florence found herself studying Blake when she thought he wasn't looking the confident way he moved, the strength evident in his form, the occasional softening of his expression when he glanced her way. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly. The sheriff said you keep to yourself. Blake's pace didn't falter. Sheriff talks too much. You didn't have to escort me, certainly didn't have to risk your life swinging across that canyon. He stopped then, turning to face her. The lantern light cast shadows across his features, making them even more angular. Would you rather I'd let you fall? No, of course not, Florence said quickly. Most men wouldn't have done what you did. Something like pain flickered across his face. I'm not most men. No, Florence agreed softly. You're certainly not. They continued walking, but something had shifted between them. Florence felt a tension, an awareness that hadn't been there before. By the time they reached the ridge, the moon had risen, bathing the landscape in silver light. The cabin stood silhouetted against the night sky, a solid structure built of logs and stone. It was larger than Florence had expected, with a covered porch and what looked like a small barn behind it. Home sweet home, Blake said, handing her the lantern. Your father built it himself. Florence climbed the porch steps, feeling a strange mix of emotions. This was her father's dream, the place he had chosen over staying with her in Boston. Now it was hers, this wild, beautiful, dangerous place. Blake pushed open the door, checking inside before allowing her to enter. The interior was simple but comfortable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, a small kitchen area, and doors leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. I'll get a fire going, Blake said, moving to the fireplace. Nights get cold up here. Florence set the lantern on the table and looked around. Everything was neat and orderly, as if her father had just stepped out for a moment. Books lined a small shelf. A pair of reading glasses sat on a side table. It struck her suddenly that she was standing in the place where her father had lived his final years, and tears pricked at her eyes. Blake had the fire crackling quickly, its warm light filling the cabin. He stood, dusting his hands on his trousers. I should go. You'll be safe here tonight. Go. Florence asked, alarmed. But how will you get back? The bridge is out and it's the middle of the night. I know these mountains. There's a hunter's cabin about 2 miles west. I can stay there. That's absurd, Florence said firmly. This cabin has 2 bedrooms. You saved my life today. The least I can offer is shelter for the night. Blake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Not proper. A man and woman alone. Florence almost smiled at his concern. Mr. Vasquez Blake, I think we left propriety behind when you swung across a canyon to save me from plummeting to my death. I trust you're a gentleman and I'm too exhausted to worry about appearances. After a moment he nodded. If you're sure. I am. Now, is there anything to eat in this cabin? I'm famished. Blake moved to a cupboard, pulling out jars of preserved food. Your father kept a good pantry. There's venison jerky, preserves, beans, cornmeal. Together, they prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread from the stored meal, and slices of dried venison softened in the pan. As they ate at the table, Florence noticed Blake watching her with curiosity. "What is it?" she asked. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Jeb described his daughter as a proper Boston lady who'd never survive a day in Colorado territory. Florence bristled slightly. "And what do you think?" Blake's gaze was steady. "I think you nearly died today and still managed to walk 5 miles through rough country without complaining once. There's steel in you, Florence Sullivan." His unexpected compliment warmed her more than the fire. "My father left when I was 12. Perhaps he didn't know me as well as he thought." "Perhaps not," Blake agreed. He hesitated, then added, "He regretted leaving you, spoke of it often." Florence set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "Did he? Yet he never came back, never invited me here until he was dying." Blake was quiet for a moment. Men make mistakes. Some mistakes seem too big to fix. Like abandoning your child. Florence couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I can't defend what he did," Blake said. "But I can tell you he loved you. That's why he wanted you to have this place. A cabin in the wilderness." "What am I supposed to do with it? I know nothing about ranching or farming or whatever my father did here." Blake's expression softened slightly. "Maybe that's not why he wanted you to come." "Then why?" Florence demanded. "That's for you to discover." Blake rose, taking their plates to the wash basin. "You should get some rest. Morning comes early here." Florence knew he was right. Exhaustion pulled at her, and the day's terror and excitement had taken their toll. She found the bedroom clearly intended as her father's, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt. The other, smaller room held a narrower bed, likely for guests. "You take my father's room," she said to Blake. "I'll use the smaller one." Blake shook his head firmly. "No, that's your room now." "I'll be fine in the other." Too tired to argue, Florence gathered her small traveling case that Blake had thoughtfully brought from her saddle. "Good night then, Mr. Vasquez, and thank you again for everything." Something like a smile touched his lips. "Good night, Miss Sullivan. Tomorrow, we'll figure out how to get your horses back." Florence closed the bedroom door behind her, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She changed quickly into her nightgown, shivering in the cool air, then slid beneath the heavy quilt. The bed smelled faintly of tobacco, and pine, her father's scent from her childhood memories. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the occasional creak of floorboards as Blake moved in the main room, banking the fire for the night. This wild place was so different from Boston, so dangerous and yet strangely exhilarating. And Blake Vasquez was unlike any man she had ever known. Florence fingered her father's pocket watch, which she still carried in her dress pocket. "Why did you want me here, Father?" she whispered to the darkness. "What secrets am I supposed to discover?" Sleep finally claimed her, and she dreamed of falling, of strong arms catching her, of blue eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart race even in slumber. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the small window. Florence woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, pinning her auburn hair into a practical bun. The scent of coffee greeted her when she opened the bedroom door. Blake stood at the small cast iron stove, frying what looked like slices of salt pork. "You're still here," she said, surprised. She had half expected him to be gone by morning. He glanced over his shoulder. "Said I'd help get your horses back. A Vasquez keeps his word." Florence approached the stove, the rich aroma of coffee making her realize how thirsty she was. "Is there enough for me?" Blake nodded toward a cup he'd already poured. "Sugar's in the canister if you need it." "Thank you." She took the cup, savoring the warmth between her palms. "What's the plan for today?" "First breakfast. Then we head back to get the horses after that." He hesitated. "Figured you might want to see the property, your property." Florence nodded. "Yes, I'd like that very much." They ate in companionable silence, Florence surprised by how good the simple meal tasted. When they finished, Blake showed her where to find fresh water from the pump outside, and together they washed the dishes. "Your father built that pump himself," Blake commented. "Ran the pipe from a spring higher up the mountain. Clever man, your father." Florence studied Blake as they worked side by side. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed the night before: a small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his nape, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than she'd seen. "How did you know my father?" she asked. Blake concentrated on drying a plate. "I've been in these parts about 5 years. Your father helped me when I first arrived, gave me work when I needed it." "What kind of work?" "What did my father do here?" "Ranching, mostly. Had a small herd of cattle, did some prospecting too." "Gold?" Florence asked, surprised. Blake nodded. "These mountains have their secrets. Your father found a few of them." "Is that what he wanted me to know? That he found gold?" Blake's expression grew guarded again. "Like I said, some things you need to discover for yourself." After they finished the dishes, they set out to retrieve the horses. The day was clear and bright, the landscape even more breathtaking than Florence had imagined. Rolling hills gave way to dramatic mountains in the distance, the valley below lush with late summer grasses. "It's beautiful," she said softly as they walked. "I can see why my father loved it." Blake glanced at her. "Different from Boston, I imagine. Entirely, but in a good way. There's a freedom here." "Freedom comes with its own dangers," Blake replied. "As you learned yesterday." "Yes," Florence agreed, unconsciously moving closer to him as they approached the canyon rim. "I haven't properly thanked you for what you did. It was extraordinarily brave." Blake shrugged, seeming uncomfortable with her praise. "Did what anyone would do." "No," Florence shook her head firmly. "Not anyone. Most men would have watched me fall rather than risk themselves." Blake was quiet for a moment as they walked. Finally, he said, "Maybe I've seen enough people fall." There was something in his tone that told Florence not to press further. They reached the canyon edge where they'd left the horses, finding them grazing contentedly, still secured to the tree. "We'll need to take the long way around," Blake explained, untying the animals. "There's another crossing point about 3 miles east, not as direct but safer." Florence nodded, allowing him to help her mount. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lifting her effortlessly into the saddle. Their eyes met briefly as he stepped back, and Florence felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks. The journey back to the cabin took most of the morning, following a winding trail that eventually brought them to a shallow portion of the river where they could safely cross. By the time they returned, the sun was high overhead. "I'd like to see the rest of the property," Florence said as they unsaddled the horses at the small barn behind the cabin. Blake nodded. "It's extensive. Nearly 200 acres. We should eat something first." After a quick meal of leftover cornbread and jerky, Blake saddled the horses again, and they set out to explore the property. He showed her the small herd of cattle grazing in a valley to the north, the creek that provided water even in the dry season, and the stands of timber that her father had selectively harvested for building and fuel. He planned well, Blake explained as they rode. Set things up so the land would provide what was needed without taking too much. You admired him, Florence observed. He was a good man, made mistakes like we all do but tried to make amends. They crested a rise and Blake reined his horse to a stop. Florence pulled up beside him, gasping at the vista spread before them. The valley below was like something from a painting, with a small lake reflecting the blue sky, surrounded by aspen trees beginning to show the first hint of autumn gold. This was his favorite spot, Blake said quietly. He called it Florence Lake. Tears pricked her eyes unexpectedly. He named it after me, Blake nodded. Said it reminded him of you, beautiful but deep. Florence was silent, absorbing this unexpected connection to her father. He had carried her in his heart, even as the miles separated them. There's something else I need to show you, Blake said after a moment. Something important. He led her down a narrow trail that wound around the lake and up another slope. As they reached the top, Florence saw a small clearing with what looked like the entrance to a mine shaft, fortified with timber supports. Is this where he prospected? She asked as they dismounted. Blake nodded, tying the horses to a nearby tree. This is what he wanted you to see, Florence. He retrieved a lantern hanging near the entrance, lit it, and gestured for her to follow him inside. The tunnel was surprisingly wide and tall enough for them to walk upright. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper into the mountain. My father dug all this. Florence asked, impressed despite her nervousness. With some help, Blake confirmed. He was determined. They reached a wooden door set into the tunnel wall. Blake produced a key from his pocket, unlocked it, and swung it open. After you. Florence stepped inside, holding the lantern high. The chamber was small but neat, with a desk, chair, and shelves built into the rock walls. On the desk sat a wooden box and an envelope with her name written in her father's familiar handwriting. I'll wait outside, Blake said quietly. This is between you and your father. When he had gone, Florence approached the desk with trembling hands. She set down the lantern and picked up the envelope, breaking the seal with unsteady fingers. My dearest Florence, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I have passed from this world without seeing you one last time. This is my greatest regret. I left you when you needed me most, and no amount of success or discovery can erase that failing. I told myself I was seeking a better future for us both, but the truth is simpler and harder. I was a coward who couldn't face his grief over your mother's death. In leaving Boston, I thought I was running from pain, but I only created more for you and for myself. Every day without you has been a day incomplete. I named the most beautiful place on this property after you, hoping somehow that connection would ease the distance between us. What I found here in these mountains was unexpected. The box on this desk contains gold enough to secure your future, wherever you choose to make it. But the real treasure of this place isn't in metal or land. It's in the possibility of a life lived fully, honestly, and freely. I've instructed Blake Vasquez to help you. He is the most honorable man I've ever known, and the only one I would trust with your safety and this secret. He knows everything about this property and has been my right hand these past years. The deed to the land is in the box with the gold. It is all yours now to keep or sell as you choose. My only wish is that you find happiness, whether that's here in Colorado or back in Boston. I love you, my darling daughter. I always have, even when I failed to show it. Your loving father, Jebediah Sullivan. Tears streamed down Florence's face as she carefully folded the letter. She opened the wooden box to find several leather pouches of gold nuggets and dust, along with property deeds and bank documents. Her father had indeed been successful in his prospecting. She wiped her eyes and carried the lantern back to the tunnel entrance. Blake stood just outside, his back to the mine, staring out at the valley below. "You knew," she said. "About the gold, the letter, everything." He turned, his expression solemn. "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" "Wasn't my place. Your father wanted you to find it yourself, to read his words without my interference." Florence studied him in the afternoon light. "The letter said you were his right hand, that he trusted you above all others." Blake nodded once. "Are you his partner in the mine?" she asked. "No. I helped him work it, but he always maintained it was for you, said it was your inheritance to make up for the years he wasn't there." Florence felt overwhelmed. In a single day, she had become a wealthy woman. She could return to Boston, buy a fine house, live comfortably for the rest of her life. "What would you do?" she asked suddenly. "If you were me," Blake looked surprised by the question. "Doesn't matter what I'd do. It matters to me," she insisted. "Please." He was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Land like this, it gets in your blood, the freedom, the challenges, even the dangers. It's a life that asks everything of you but gives back just as much." "You love it here," Florence observed. "Yes," he admitted. "But Boston probably has its charms too." "Boston is predictable, safe." Florence looked out at the vast landscape. "This is alive, terrifying and magnificent." Blake watched her, something flickering in his eyes, like falling from a bridge and being caught. Florence met his gaze, feeling a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Exactly like that. They rode back to the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Florence was quiet, processing everything she had learned. Blake respected her silence, only speaking to point out features of the land she might not have noticed. As they approached the cabin, Florence made her decision. "I want to stay," she announced. "At least for a while, to get to know this place, to understand what my father loved about it." Blake glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "It won't be easy. Winter comes early in the mountains. There's work to be done before the snow flies." "Will you help me?" Florence asked. "Teach me what I need to know, if that's what you want," he replied cautiously. "It is." She looked directly at him. "My father trusted you. I find that I do too." A hint of a smile touched Blake's lips. "Then we've got work to do, Miss Sullivan." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Blake taught Florence everything she needed to know about managing the property. He showed her how to care for the small herd of cattle, how to split wood for the winter, how to preserve the late summer vegetables from her father's garden. Blake lived in a small cabin about a mile away, riding over each morning and leaving after dinner each evening. Florence found herself looking forward to his arrival and regretting his departure with equal intensity. He was patient with her mistakes, quietly pleased with her successes, and always respectful of her position as the property's owner. As September gave way to October, the aspen trees turned brilliant gold, and the air grew increasingly crisp. Florence was surprised by how quickly she adapted to life in the mountains. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew stronger and more capable. Her fear of the wilderness transformed into cautious respect. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Florence watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, she said, "Winter is coming soon." Blake nodded. "First snow could be any day now. We've got the cabin prepared, wood stacked, food stored. You'll be comfortable enough." "Will you stay here?" she asked. "When the snow comes, the journey between cabins will be difficult." Blake hesitated, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Wouldn't be proper." "Proper," Florence repeated with a small laugh. "I've been thinking about that word a lot lately. In Boston, proper ruled everything. Here, it seems less important somehow." "Still matters," Blake said quietly. My reputation is hardly at risk out here," Florence interrupted. "And I'm not suggesting anything improper, Blake. The cabin has 2 bedrooms. I'm simply concerned about your safety traveling between properties in bad weather." Blake was silent for a long moment. "There's a solution. My cabin has a good stone foundation. We could dismantle the log portion and rebuild it as an addition to this one. Separate entrance connected by a covered walkway. Give us both privacy but solve the winter travel problem." Florence smiled, pleased by his practical compromise. "That sounds perfect. When can we start?" "Tomorrow, if weather holds." The project consumed the next 2 weeks. Florence worked alongside Blake, learning to notch logs and mix mortar for the stone foundation. Other men from nearby properties came to help with the heavy-lifting neighbors she hadn't known she had until Blake introduced them. As they worked, Florence found herself watching Blake when he wasn't looking, the way the muscles in his arms flexed as he hefted logs into place, the quiet authority with which he directed the work, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally lit his features. She was falling in love with him. She realized one evening as she watched him thank the neighbors who had helped that day. The knowledge didn't shock her as much as she might have expected. It felt natural, inevitable, like the changing seasons or the flow of the river through the canyon. The addition was nearly complete when the first snow fell, light flurries that dusted the ground and melted by midday. But it was a warning that couldn't be ignored. "We need to finish the roof today," Blake announced at breakfast. "Storm coming tomorrow will be the real thing." They worked tirelessly through the day, Florence handing up shingles as Blake secured them to the roof frame. By sunset, the addition was weathertight, with only interior details remaining. "Perfect timing," Blake said as they stood admiring their work in the gathering dusk. The first heavy snowflakes were beginning to fall, large and wet against their upturned faces. "We did it," Florence said, feeling an unexpected surge of pride. "We built something." Blake looked down at her, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on his eyelashes. "You've built more than you know these past weeks, Florence." His use of her first name sent a warm shiver through her. "What do you mean? You've built a life here, made this place yours. Your father would be proud." Florence was suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from Blake's body in the cold evening air. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have," he contradicted quietly. "You're stronger than you know." The snow was falling more heavily now, the world around them growing silent under its white blanket. Florence felt caught in a moment out of time, with only Blake's blue eyes anchoring her to reality. "We should go inside," Blake said finally, his voice deeper than usual. "Storm's coming fast." They moved their few belongings into the newly constructed addition, Blake insisting that Florence take the main cabin while he settled into his new quarters. Though connected by a covered walkway, the arrangement would give them both the privacy that propriety demanded. That night, as the storm howled around the cabin and snow piled against the windows, Florence lay awake listening to the occasional sounds of movement from Blake's quarters. So close, yet separated by more than just walls. The blizzard lasted 3 days, burying the property under several feet of snow. Florence and Blake fell into a comfortable routine, sharing meals, tending to necessary chores, and spending evenings by the fire. Blake taught her to play checkers and poker, laughing at her competitive spirit. Florence read aloud from her father's books, discovering that Blake had a keen mind and thoughtful opinions on everything from philosophy to politics. On the 4th evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Florence finally asked the question that had been on her mind since the day they met. "Why did you really help me that first day, Blake? The sheriff said you keep to yourself, yet you agreed to guide a stranger to a remote property at dusk." Blake stared into the fire for a long moment. Your father asked me to look out for you. Before he died, he made me promise. But you did more than look out for me. You risked your life. Blake shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. I've lost people I couldn't save. Wasn't going to let that happen again if I could help it. Florence sensed there was more to the story. Who did you lose? The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, my wife and son. 5 years ago, river crossing in Texas. Spring flood came faster than anyone expected. Florence's heart constricted. Oh, Blake, I'm so sorry. I couldn't reach them in time, he continued, his voice tight. Watch them get swept away. That's when I headed north. Couldn't stay in a place with those memories. And you came to Colorado, he nodded. Your father found me half dead from exhaustion and grief, gave me work purpose, never asked questions, just offered what I needed most, a reason to keep going. Florence rose from her chair and knelt beside his, taking his hand in both of hers. Thank you for telling me, and thank you for saving me. Blake looked down at their joined hands, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a surrender. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over almost before it began. Blake drew back, watching her with uncertain eyes. I shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. Florence touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his. Yes, you should have. I've been hoping you would. Blake's expression changed to one of wonder. You have. Instead of answering, Florence leaned forward and kissed him again, this time with more certainty. His hand came up to cradle her face, his touch achingly tender. When they finally parted, Blake rested his forehead against hers. Florence, I need you to be sure. I'm not a wealthy man. I don't have much to offer except hard work and loyalty. Those are worth more than gold, she whispered. And I have enough gold for both of us, remember? A smile tugged at his lips. Your father might haunt me for this. No, Florence shook her head. I think he hoped for exactly this outcome. Why else would he have trusted you with his most precious things, his property and his daughter? The winter passed in a slow dance of growing intimacy. Blake and Florence maintained separate quarters, honoring the proprieties they both respected. But their days were spent together in work and conversation, their evenings in increasingly tender companionship. By February, they had established a comfortable routine. Blake handled the outdoor work, caring for the cattle in their winter pasture, checking trap lines for rabbit and fox, occasionally hunting deer when their stored meat ran low. Florence managed the cabin, experimenting with recipes from her father's old cookbook, mending clothing, and learning to make soap and candles from the supplies they had stored. On Valentine's Day, a holiday Florence had mentioned casually the week before, she awoke to find a small carved wooden box outside her bedroom door. Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a bridge, with tiny figures suspended above it. Blake stood in the doorway between their quarters, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Thought you might like a reminder of how we met. Florence's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the pendant. It's beautiful. Did you make this? He nodded. Been working on it evenings. Silver's from your father's mine. Not much, just a small vein we found last year. Help me put it on, she asked, holding out the necklace. Blake stepped behind her, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The simple touch sent shivers down her spine. Perfect, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Florence turned in his arms, lifting her face to his. I love you, Blake Vasquez. The words had been in her heart for months, but she had hesitated to speak them, unsure if Blake was ready to hear them. Now, watching his expression transform from surprise to joy, she knew she had chosen the right moment. I love you too, Florence Sullivan, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Have since the moment you refused to be intimidated by that canyon. Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with the promise of a future neither had dared imagine months before. When they finally drew apart, Blake took her hand and led her to the fireplace. I have something else for you, something I've been wanting to ask. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band. This was my mother's. I've carried it all these years, never thinking I'd have cause to offer it to anyone again. He knelt before her, the ring held between his fingers. Florence Sullivan, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Florence felt tears spill down her cheeks as joy bubbled up within her. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Blake. Nothing would make me happier. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. When spring comes, he promised, we'll ride into Julesburg and make it official, though I consider you my wife already in my heart. As I consider you my husband, she replied, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Spring arrived slowly, the snow retreating inch by inch as March gave way to April. The world outside their cabin transformed from white to brown to green, new life bursting forth wherever they looked. On a particularly fine day in early May, Blake saddled their horses for the journey into Julesburg. Florence wore her best dress, saved for this occasion, and Blake had trimmed his beard and donned a clean shirt and string tie. Ready to become Mrs. Vasquez? He asked as he helped her mount. More than ready, Florence replied, touching the bridge pendant that she hadn't taken off since Valentine's Day. They rode side by side into town, the journey far easier than that first perilous trip nearly a year before. The sheriff, who had become a friend during their occasional winter visits to town for supplies, had arranged for the circuit judge to marry them. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held in the small church with a handful of neighbors and townspeople as witnesses. Florence felt her father's presence as she spoke her vows, certain he was watching with approval as she joined her life to the man he had trusted above all others. That evening, they returned to the cabin, their home as husband and wife. As they stood on the porch watching the sunset, Blake's arm around her waist, Florence marveled at how completely her life had changed in less than a year. Any regrets? Blake asked, seeming to read her thoughts. About staying here instead of returning to Boston, Florence shook her head. Not one. This is where I belong. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had swung across a canyon to save her and in doing so had saved himself as well. With you. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. The property flourished under their joint care, the cattle herd growing, the mine producing enough gold to ensure their comfort without ostentation. They expanded the cabin to accommodate their growing family, first a son, whom they named Jebediah after Florence's father, and 2 years later, a daughter they called Eleanor, after Blake's mother. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Blake took Florence back to the canyon where the bridge had once hung. A new, sturdier structure now spanned the gap, built by Blake and neighboring ranchers to ensure safer passage. Remember how afraid you were? He asked as they stood hand in hand at the edge. I remember how you didn't hesitate, she replied. Not for a second. Blake squeezed her hand. Best reckless decision I ever made, Florence laughed, the sound echoing across the canyon. I think we've both learned when to be cautious and when to take a leap of faith. That evening, as their children slept and they sat together on the porch of their home, Florence read her father's letter, once more a tradition she maintained each year on this anniversary. He was right, you know, she said, carefully refolding the yellowed paper. The real treasure wasn't the gold, it was the possibility of a life lived fully. Blake nodded, his arm around her shoulders. And have you lived fully? Florence looked up at him, at the face she had come to know better than her own. The lines at his eyes had deepened with the years, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. But his blue eyes still held the same steadfast courage that had given her strength that first day. "Every moment," she assured him, leaning against his solid warmth. "Every single moment." As twilight settled over the Colorado mountains, Florence thought about the remarkable chain of events that had brought her here. A broken bridge, a father's final wish, a brave man's leap across a chasm. Such small moments that had changed everything. The rope bridge had snapped, but what had seemed like disaster had instead been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life. And as Blake's lips found hers in the gathering darkness, Florence knew with absolute certainty that some falls were really just a different way of learning to fly. In the years that followed, Florence and Blake Vasquez became pillars of the growing community around Julesburg. The property, which they officially named Sullivan's Ridge, expanded as they purchased neighboring land. Their cattle operation thrived, and they became known for their fair dealings and generosity during hard times. Their children grew strong and capable in the mountain air. Young Jeb inherited his father's quiet confidence and his mother's determined spirit, while Alina displayed a keen intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond their mountains. On Jeb's 10th birthday, Blake took him to the mine and showed him the small seam of gold that had helped secure their family's future. "Your grandfather found this," Blake explained. "But he understood something important, that land and family are worth more than any metal we might pull from the earth." The boy nodded solemnly. "Is that why you and Mama only take a little each year?" Blake smiled at his son's perception. "Exactly. We take what we need, not what we want. That's how we ensure there's enough for your future and your children's future." Alina, at 8, was already showing signs of her grandmother's refined education. Florence taught both children from books she ordered from Denver and Boston, ensuring they learned not only the practical skills needed for life in the mountains, but also literature, mathematics, and history. "Will I go to Boston someday, Mama?" Alina asked one evening as Florence brushed her daughter's dark hair, so like Blake's in color and texture. "If you wish to," Florence replied. "The world is open to you, my darling." "But you came from Boston and stayed here instead," the child observed. Florence smiled, remembering. "I found something here I never expected to find, a home for my heart." When the children were in bed, Florence shared this conversation with Blake as they sat by the fire. "She has your restless spirit," Blake observed, "the one that brought you west despite all warnings." "And your courage," Florence added. "Did you see her on that pony yesterday? Not a hint of fear, even when it shied at the rattlesnake." Blake's expression grew serious. "We'll need to save for their education. Jeb might be content with ranching, but Alina, she'll want more. College, perhaps." "We have the means," Florence assured him, thinking of the carefully invested funds from the mine's modest but steady yield. "And we have time. They're still children." But time, as Florence had learned, moved in its own mysterious ways. The children grew taller with each passing season. The saplings they had planted along the drive to the cabin became sturdy trees. The community around them evolved from scattered homesteads to a proper settlement, with its own small school and church. In their 15th year of marriage, as summer gave way to autumn, Blake and Florence hosted a celebration at Sullivan's Ridge. Neighbors from miles around gathered to mark the completion of a new community meeting hall that the Vasquez family had largely funded. "Your father would be proud," Sheriff Thomas, now gray and nearing retirement, told Florence as they watched Blake directing the young men setting up tables for the feast. "He always said this valley needed people who could see beyond their own fences." "Thank you," Florence replied, touched by the mention of her father. "I like to think he's watching somehow." The celebration lasted well into the evening with music and dancing under the stars. Florence watched with pride as 16-year-old Jeb confidently led a neighbor's daughter in a waltz, while 14-year-old Alina engaged the visiting circuit judge in what appeared to be a serious discussion of constitutional law. "Our children are growing up," Blake observed, coming to stand beside her. "Soon they'll be making their own choices, finding their own paths." Florence leaned against his shoulder, still solid and strong after all these years. "And we'll be here to catch them if they fall." Blake's arm tightened around her waist. "Always." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children had gone to bed, Blake and Florence walked hand in hand to the ridge overlooking Florence Lake. The moon cast a silver path across the water, and the autumn air held the first hint of winter's approach. "20 years ago, I thought my life was over," Blake said quietly. "After Emily and little Thomas died, I couldn't imagine feeling anything but grief ever again." Florence squeezed his hand, honored that he could now speak of his first wife and son without the crushing pain that had once accompanied their names. "And then, a stubborn Boston woman refused to wait until morning to cross a dangerous canyon," he continued, a smile in his voice. "And everything changed. I was terrified," Florence admitted, "not just of the canyon but of everything. This wild place, my father's legacy, the future without the security I'd known in Boston." "You never showed it," Blake said. "Not once." "I did that night," she reminded him. "After you saved me, I cried when I thought you couldn't see." Blake turned to face her, framing her face with his hands. Though lined with years of sun and weather, his face was still handsome, his blue eyes as clear and direct as the day they had met. "I saw, I heard. I felt every tear as if it were my own. That's when I knew." "Knew what?" Florence asked, though after 15 years of marriage she thought she knew the answer. "That I'd do anything to keep you from crying again. That somehow, despite all my walls and scars, you'd found your way into my heart." Florence rose on tiptoe to kiss him, this man who had literally swung across a chasm to save her life and, in doing so, had saved himself. "I love you, Blake Vasquez. More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." As they made their way back to the cabin, arm in arm under the vast canopy of stars, Florence felt a sense of completion that transcended ordinary happiness. The path had not always been easy. There had been harsh winters, drought summers, illnesses, and disagreements. But through it all, they had built something remarkable, not just a home or a ranch, but a legacy of love that would outlast them both. In their bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the window, Blake held her close. "No regrets?" he asked, as he sometimes did on significant occasions. "Not one," Florence assured him, meaning it completely. "Every step, every decision, every moment has led us here. How could I regret any of it?" The following morning, Florence woke early and slipped out to watch the sunrise from the porch. The valley stretched before her, painted in shades of gold and amber as the first rays of light touched the mountain peaks. 20 years ago, she had arrived in Julesburg as a proper Boston lady with soft hands and uncertain purpose. Now she stood firmly planted in this wild, beautiful land, her heart full and her spirit at peace. Blake joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Florence smiled up at him, this man who had become the center of her world. "About bridges," she said. "The ones that fall and the ones we build." Blake nodded, understanding as he always did. "Some bridges are meant to break," he observed, "so we can build stronger ones. Or find different ways to cross the gaps," Florence agreed, touching the silver bridge pendant she still wore after all these years. As the sun climbed higher, painting the world in morning light, Florence thought about the remarkable journey that had brought her here. A broken bridge, a brave rescue, a father's legacy, a love that had grown deeper with each passing year. The rope bridge had snapped as she crossed, but it hadn't been an ending. It had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life, an adventure that continued to unfold with each new day, each new challenge, each new joy. And Blake had been there through it all, her partner, her love, her safe harbor in a world of uncertainty. Together they had built something stronger than any bridge, a life filled with purpose, passion, and enduring love. As Blake's arm tightened around her waist, Florence leaned against him, grateful for the broken bridge that had led her to this unbreakable bond. Some falls, she had learned, were really just another way of learning to fly.